You are sitting in your living room. The glow of the television lights up the dark space. On the screen, an impeccably dressed politician stares solemnly into the camera lens, their faces tight with manufactured concern. They lean forward, they issue a grave warning, they tell you that our democracy is under threat. That word "our" wraps around you like a warm blanket. You are meant to feel part of a grand shared project. You're supposed to nod along in civic solidarity. But then you notice the catch. You watch how this same figure reacts to a protest they happen to dislike. You see a citizen ruined for an unapproved opinion. You watch the boundaries of acceptable speech shrink in real time. The warm blanket suddenly feels like a straitjacket. When they say "our," they do not mean you, they mean them, their institutions, their rules, their absolute right to dictate the boundaries of reality. You are generously invited to take part, but only if you vote correctly. Only if you speak using their approved vocabulary. Why does the heavy hand of justice crush one group, but gently stroke another?
Why does free speech suddenly become dangerous misinformation the exact moment the wrong person opens their mouth? We love to call this hypocrisy. We point fingers, we cry double standards, we assume the system is broken. But what if we are entirely wrong? What if the system is working exactly as intended, driven by a cold, hidden logic that silently divides the entire world into two very distinct camps? And the theoretical framework that actually unlocks this whole seemingly broken system, it was articulated over a century ago.
Yeah.
Because when we look at modern institutional behavior, whether it's, government actions during a crisis or the statistical outcomes of the justice system or even the internal moderation policies of these massive tech platforms, it becomes really clear that these extreme double standards aren't a malfunction. They're a sign of a system functioning precisely according to a foundational political logic. And to understand that logic, we have to look at Carl Schmitt.
Right. And that is exactly where we have to start this deep dive. Because Carl Schmitt, he was a German jurist and a political theorist, lived from 1888 to 1985. He provides this lens that is undeniably chilling, but honestly, it's incredibly accurate for understanding modern governance.
Yeah.
And look, he is a highly controversial figure, primarily because of his later association with the Nazi Party in the 1930s. That casts a massive dark shadow over his legacy. But his earlier critiques of liberal democracy, which he wrote during the Weimar Republic, they remain some of the most studied frameworks in political science today.
By people on all sides of the political spectrum.
Right. Absolutely, across the entire ideological spectrum. Because to comprehend why institutions behave the way they do right now, you really have to deeply understand two of his foundational concepts.
Okay, because they really form the bedrock of the entire analysis we're doing today. So the first concept is his definition of sovereignty. And I think in modern everyday conversation, when people hear sovereignty, they usually think of like a monarch or maybe national borders or just the idea of who holds office and writes the laws.
Yeah, the person with the fancy title.
But Schmitt's definition is entirely different. It's much more cute than that.
In his 1922 work, which is called Political Theology, he famously declared, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception."
Sovereign is he who decides on the exception.
Right. And that single sentence just radically shifts how we are meant to view power. Because in a liberal democracy, the operating assumption is that the law is supreme, right? The Constitution dictates how power is transferred, how laws are written, how disputes are resolved. It's all about the rules.
Power is supposed to be perpetual and strictly bound by those rules. But Schmitt argued that this is just an illusion. It's an illusion that only really holds up during normal, peaceful times.
Right, because normal times don't really test the limits of the system, do they?
You don't know how a system really works until it's under extreme stress. So the true test of power is the exception, the unprecedented crisis, the severe emergency, the existential threat that the normal, everyday legal order just cannot handle. So sovereignty, according to Schmitt, is not defined by who passes the budget or who fills the potholes. True sovereignty is the ability to recognize that existential threat, to officially suspend the normal legal order, and then dictate what happens outside the bounds of established law. The sovereign is the entity or the individual that decides when the rules no longer apply.
So it's the power to declare the emergency and then operate completely unconstrained by the laws that govern society just yesterday.
That leads directly into the second foundational concept, which dictates how that unconstrained power is actually aimed or utilized once they have it. And that's the friend-enemy distinction.
So about 10 years after Political Theology, Schmitt published the concept of the political. And in it, he argued that every realm of human endeavor has a core underlying distinction. Well, in morality, the distinction is good versus evil. In aesthetics, it's beautiful versus ugly. In economics, it's profitable versus unprofitable.
Right.
But then he asked, what is the core distinction of politics? And he concluded that all political actions and all political motives can ultimately be reduced to the distinction between friend and enemy.
And I think it's crucial to clarify here that he is not talking about, like, personal animosity.
Yeah.
This isn't about two politicians who just happen to dislike each other or two corporations competing for market share.
Yeah. No, it is not a private interpersonal dislike. It is an existential public division. The essence of politics here is dividing the world into a political in-group and a political out-group.
So the friends and the enemies.
Right. The friends belong to the community. They are seen as the righteous, the legitimate, the defenders of the proper order. The enemies are not just people with differing opinions on tax policy. They are defined as an existential threat to the entire order. They're a group whose very existence or ideology threatens to negate the way of life of the in-group.
Okay, so if we accept this framework that sovereignty is the power to declare an exception and politics is the act of dividing the world into friends and existential enemies, it implies that every systemic action, like every declaration of a state of emergency, is just a pretext for consolidating power against that outgroup. But I have to ask, if this framework implies every systemic action is just a pretext for consolidating power against an enemy, how do we differentiate between a genuine crisis response and a Schmittian power grab?
Yeah.
I mean, there are real emergencies in the world. The viral pandemic is a real biological event. A violent mob attacking a building is a real physical threat. And economic collapse is a real material reality. So how is a line drawn between the necessary self-preservation of a society and the cynical weaponization of the exception just to punish political outgroups?
Well, the analytical reality of Schmitt's view is that the distinction is totally irrelevant.
Wait, irrelevant.
The objective reality of the crisis, whether the virus is real, whether the mob is violent, is merely the vehicle. The defining factor is who possesses the power to suspend the rules in response to it.
So the emergency doesn't matter as much as who takes control during it.
The emergency itself does not govern the society. The sovereign governs the society through the emergency. We're taught in liberal democracies that laws govern unconditionally, that institutions act as these neutral arbiters applying rules to solve a crisis. Schmitt argued that this neutrality is a complete and total illusion.
Because when the crisis hits, the mask of neutrality inevitably slips.
It has to. The legal order is not suspended just to solve a practical logistical problem. It's suspended to preserve the political power of the in-group. The sovereign utilizes the reality of the crisis to decide who is protected by the suspension of law and who is crushed by it. The crisis is real, but the response is entirely political, heavily determined by that friend-enemy distinction. The sovereign decides who must bear the burden of the emergency measures and who gets to be exempt from them.
Okay, so to see how this theoretical framework moves from abstract 1920s philosophy into concrete modern reality, we can look at specific scenarios, because we have three distinct domains to analyze today: emergency government powers, the judicial system, and digital platforms. So let's start with emergency governance, specifically looking at the United Kingdom during the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Right, and to understand the application of Schmitt's state of exception here, it's highly instructive to look at the physical reality of how these laws were experienced by regular people versus how they were enacted by the elite.
Yes, the contrast is everything.
So consider a very specific scenario that encapsulates this dynamic. Think about the physical space of Whitehall, the center of the UK government in December 2020. The sensory contrast alone tells the story of sovereignty. Imagine the environment of a night custodian working in those government buildings.
Okay, so he's there late at night.
Right. And the physical environment is defined by the stench of stale Pinot Grigio and expensive artisanal cheese mingling with the harsh chemical odor of industrial bleach from his mop bucket. He is cleaning the checkered floor of a garden room where the political elite have just concluded a massive gathering.
A gathering that is occurring while the rest of the country is under extreme, legally mandated isolation.
And in this scenario, there's a television in the corner of the room. It's muted, but it's broadcasting the Prime Minister's solemn face, issuing the emergency decree that families must remain apart for Christmas to protect the vulnerable.
The juxtaposition there is wild.
It is, and Arthur is experiencing the severe, crushing weight of those exact decrees. He has just buried his mother, forced to watch her casket lower into the ground on a laggy, pixelated Zoom call on his phone.
Oh, man.
Because the emergency regulations legally forbade him from traveling to her hospital bedside or attending a normal funeral. That is the physical manifestation of the law on the citizen.
And the physical manifestation of the law on the lawmaker is the debris Arthur is sweeping up.
Exactly. He's sweeping up discarded party hats and dozens of empty wine bottles left behind by the very architects of those emergency laws. The elite had gathered, they laughed, they drank shoulder to shoulder, completely ignoring the social distancing mandates and the gathering limits they had just broadcast to the entire nation.
It's a completely different set of rules.
Right. And as Arthur processes this, the realization is not simply that they're breaking the rule. The hollow, crushing realization is that they understand the rules were never meant for them in the first place.
They don't apply to the sovereign.
The sovereignty they preach on television is a cage built entirely for the masses. So the custodian picking up a lipstick-stained napkin in the cold epicenter of government power that represents the citizenry, recognizing the true nature of the state of exception.
That scenario really anchors the abstract theory into something visceral. It's not just a thought experiment. But the architecture that allowed that to happen isn't just about personal hypocrisy, right? Like, it's not just politicians being selfish. It is about a deliberate, structural, legal strategy. Because the LSE COVID-19 blog published extensive research analyzing the exact legal mechanisms the UK government used between March 2020 and August 2021, and the sheer volume of executive action is...
The data on those legislative mechanisms is where the Schmitt exception is practically quantified. We are talking about the introduction of over 480 statutory instruments during that period.
Okay, let's break down what a statutory instrument actually is for a moment, just so we can understand the bypass of normal democracy that happened here. Because under normal conditions, primary legislation requires a rigorous process. A bill is proposed, it goes through multiple readings in the House of Commons, it faces intense debate, it goes to committee for line-by-line scrutiny.
Right, it's debated publicly.
It goes to the House of Lords, and eventually receives royal assent. It is a slow, deliberate, and highly public process designed to check executive power. But a statutory instrument, or secondary legislation, is supposed to be used for minor, technical changes to existing laws, like updating a fee schedule or changing a specific regulatory code. It is definitely not designed for creating massive, unprecedented constraints on civil liberties.
Yet that is exactly what it was utilized for, and the research highlights a critical statistic about this. 71% of these 480 statutory instruments were subject to what is known as the made negative procedure.
Right, the made negative procedure, which is effectively a complete inversion of democratic scrutiny, because it means the regulations were signed into law by a government minister and only laid before Parliament after they had already taken effect. In fact, the data shows that nearly 44% of these regulations came into effect before Parliament even had a single opportunity to look at them. This completely breaches the established democratic convention of parliamentary scrutiny. I mean, the executive branch was writing laws that fundamentally altered the daily lives of 67 million people without any prior debate or approval from the legislative body.
It is the textbook definition of the sovereign dictating the exception. They bypass the normal legal order entirely. But the choice of which primary legislation to attach these secondary powers to that is even more revealing, because the UK government explicitly chose not to utilize the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004.
And the 2004 Act was precisely the legislation that was designed and passed specifically for managing national emergencies.
It was written for severe crises. It was literally sitting right there. But because it was written for severe crises in a liberal democratic context, it contains rigorous safeguards.
Like what kind of safeguards?
Well, if a government invokes the Civil Contingencies Act, it immediately triggers mandatory provisions for judicial review, mandatory parliamentary oversight, and strict 30-day sunset clauses, meaning the emergency powers automatically expire in 30 days unless Parliament explicitly votes to renew them. Yeah, it's a legal framework designed to contain the exception, to make sure the sovereign power is checked.
So to avoid that containment, to avoid being checked, they used a completely different law entirely. They utilized the Public Health Control of Disease Act, 1984.
And the 1984 Act was fundamentally designed for localized health issues. Say there's a localized outbreak of cholera or food poisoning in a specific town. Local magistrates could use the 1984 Act to quarantine a specific premises, like shutting down a restaurant or mandating the disinfection of a specific area.
Very localized.
It was never intended to be used as a blanket mechanism to lock down the entire nation, mandate the closure of all businesses, and confine healthy citizens to their homes. But by utilizing the 1984 Act, the executive branch was able to introduce sweeping lockdown powers through secondary legislation. They effectively bypassed all of the robust democratic checks and balances, the sunset clauses, and the parliamentary oversight that were deliberately built into the 2004 Act.
It's like using a specialized local zoning law. Something meant to regulate how high you can build a fence in a residential neighborhood and using it to declare martial law across an entire state, specifically because the actual martial law statute requires too much paperwork and oversight. The legal maneuvering wasn't an accident. It was designed explicitly to maximize executive dominance and minimize any form of accountability or democratic friction.
And the enforcement mechanisms attached to these decrees were incredibly severe. Fines of up to £10,000 were issued for breaching self-isolation rules.
£10,000. That's life-ruining money for most people.
And at one point, the government even floated and defended plans to jail individuals for up to 10 years if they lied on passenger locator forms about their recent travel history.
10 years. To put that in perspective, that is a penalty twice as severe as the maximum sentence in the UK for causing death by dangerous driving. The disproportionate nature of the threat is a key aspect of this.
The observation regarding the evasion of the Civil Contingencies Act and the severe penalties is vital because it demonstrates that the behavior of the political elite, the gathering at Whitehall, it wasn't merely casual hypocrisy. It was the ultimate calculated display of sovereignty.
Right.
Schmitt argued that the true sovereign is revealed precisely when the law is suspended, manipulated so thoroughly that it functions as a suspension of the normal democratic order. The elite exempt themselves from the restrictions because the sovereign exists outside the legal order they impose on the masses.
They don't see themselves as hypocrites because they just do not view themselves as subjects to the law in the same way the masses are.
The rules dictated through the 1984 Act were a straitjacket for the citizenry, and they were enforced with catastrophic financial and penal threats. The public faced financial ruin or imprisonment just for seeing dying relatives. Yet the architects of those rules operated in a realm of total impunity. They did not view themselves as citizens subject to the law. They viewed themselves as the sovereign entity dictating the exception. So the hypocrisy is not a glitch in the system. The double standard is the definitive proof of who holds sovereign power. And Schmitt observed the exact same dynamic during the Weimar Republic in Germany.
Right, because his theories were heavily informed by Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution.
So Article 48 was an emergency provision that allowed the president, under certain circumstances, to rule directly by decree. It allowed the suspension of basic constitutional rights such as privacy, property rights, if public order was deemed to be threatened.
Which sounds very familiar.
Schmitt analyzed this and argued that the Weimar Constitution essentially possessed two conflicting logics. On one hand, you had the liberal logic of fundamental rights and parliamentary process. On the other hand, you had a democratic, dictatorial logic of emergency power contained right there within Article 48.
So they contradict each other.
And by invoking that article, the liberal components were stripped away and the true, unconstrained sovereign power was asserted. And the UK's governance during the COVID-19 pandemic mirrored this precise mechanism. The liberal logic of Parliament was completely sidelined by the dictatorial logic of the 1984 Act's secondary legislation.
So we see the state of exception clearly in how emergencies are governed. But Schmitt's other concept, the friend-enemy distinction, it permeates institutions even when there is no declared national emergency. Right? Like, it operates quietly within the daily functioning of the state.
Totally, it's omnipresent.
So to see this, we can shift our focus from the executive branch to the judicial branch. And again, anchoring this in a specific physical scenario really helps illuminate the data we're about to discuss.
The judicial system is perhaps the most critical area to examine because it is the institution most heavily branded as neutral and objective.
We have this idea of Lady Justice with the blindfold. But imagine the physical environment of a federal courthouse, courtroom 302. Consider the perspective of someone who observes the system every single day, like a court reporter.
Right, they see everything.
Let's call her Sarah. She sits in the well of the courtroom, the stenotype machine clattering under her nimble fingers. She has been transcribing proceedings in this city for 15 years. Over that time, the idealized vision of the legal system, that concept of a blindfolded Lady Justice, has been entirely replaced by a stark, pragmatic reality. She watches the daily application of the law, and the patterns become undeniable to her.
The contrast in how the law is applied based on the political context of the defendant is exactly where the friend-enemy distinction materializes.
Yeah. So on a single day, she might transcribe two entirely different sentencings that illustrate this perfectly. In the morning, a young man stands before the judge. His offense. He threw a brick through a storefront window during a major protest. But it was a protest sanctioned and rhetorically supported by the ruling political class of that jurisdiction.
Okay.
In this scenario, the judge's voice is soft. The rhetoric is dripping with maternal understanding. The judge speaks at length about the defendant's righteous anger, the systemic frustrations that drove him to the act, and the need for restorative justice. And the sentence comes down. 6 months of probation.
The defendant is perceived, either consciously or subconsciously, as belonging to the political in-group, a friend whose underlying cause is legitimate, even if the specific action he took was technically illegal.
Then an hour later, the second defendant stands before the exact same bench. This is a middle-aged mechanic who trespassed into a government building. But the context is different. It occurred during a protest organized by the political opposition, a movement heavily vilified by the ruling class.
A different political alignment entirely.
And for this defendant, the judge's demeanor hardens into granite. The rhetoric shifts entirely. There is no talk of systemic frustration here. The judge speaks forcefully of threats to the very fabric of our republic, of sedition, and of domestic terror. The sentence comes down. 4 years in a federal penitentiary. As Sarah types the transcripts of both hearings, the syllables of absolute power are completely clear. The law in that room isn't functioning as a universal shield. It is functioning as a targeted weapon drawn solely against the outgroup. The gavel coming down sounds less like a call for impartial order and more like the slamming of an iron gate on a political enemy.
That imagery is powerful. But while that specific courtroom scenario highlights the psychological and rhetorical shift of a judge, this dynamic extends far beyond anecdotal observation. We don't have to rely on isolated stories to see this. It is deeply and irrevocably embedded in the empirical data of the justice system itself.
It's quantifiable.
It is entirely quantifiable. The disparity in how the in-group and out-group are treated is right there in the numbers.
And the research that quantifies this is incredibly robust. We're looking at a comprehensive empirical study conducted by Alma Cohen and Crystal S. Yang. They analyzed an enormous data set. Over 500,000 federal defendants sentenced between the years 1999 and 2015.
The scale of that data is what makes the findings so significant. I mean, when you are analyzing 500,000 federal cases over a 16-year period, you can isolate variables with a very high degree of statistical confidence.
You're not just guessing anymore.
And Cohen and Yang specifically designed the study to isolate the variable of the sentencing judge's political affiliation. So they categorized judges based on whether they were appointed by a Republican or a Democratic president, and then they measured the impact of that political affiliation on sentencing disparities across different demographic groups.
And what they found is crazy.
The findings reveal a stark, undeniable quantification of friend-enemy politics operating right beneath the veneer of impartial justice.
The methodology they used to isolate these variables is forensic in its detail. To ensure they were actually measuring the judge's bias and not just differences in the types of crimes committed, they compared judges within the exact same district court. They looked at judges who were handling defendants with similar criminal histories and similar baseline offense levels.
That control is everything, because it means we're looking at defendant A and defendant B, who committed essentially the same crime and have the exact same background, being sentenced in the same building, but by judges appointed by different political parties.
And when you control for all those external factors, the political affiliation of the judge drives massive sentencing gaps. Let's look at the specific data points. The study found that Republican-appointed judges sentenced black defendants to 1.4 months longer in prison than white defendants when compared directly to the baseline set by Democratic-appointed judges.
And to contextualize that 1.4-month gap, it is not a minor statistical anomaly.
No.
That specific gap, driven by the judge's political affiliation, accounts for roughly half of the entire racial sentence disparity observed in the federal system. Half of the racial disparity can be tied directly to the political ideology of the person wearing the robe.
And the disparities manifest in multiple directions because it's not just about race, it is also about gender. The data shows that Republican judges sentence female defendants to 1.5 months less than male defendants, again, compared to the baseline of their Democratic counterpart. And that 1.5-month difference accounts for roughly 30% of the average gender sentence gap in the federal courts.
What is particularly revealing about this study is how it breaks this data down geographically, because these disparities are not uniformly distributed across the entire federal judiciary. They are highly localized, driven heavily by Republican judges born in the Midwest and the South.
The regional differences are staggering because for Republican judges born in the Midwest and South, the average racial gap in sentence length actually expands. It becomes 2.4 months larger than for Democratic judges in those same courts. But when the researchers looked at Republican judges born in the West or the Northeast, the differences in both racial and gender disparities compared to Democratic judges essentially vanished. They became statistically insignificant.
This geographic concentration indicates that the disparities are inextricably linked to specific cultural and ideological frameworks. A judge raised in a specific region absorbs the prevailing political culture of that region, and that culture heavily influences their subconscious or sometimes conscious perception of who constitutes a friend to the social order and who constitutes an enemy or a threat.
It's baked into their worldview.
The ideological ties to these sentencing outcomes are undeniable.
But to understand how these ideological preferences are actually able to manifest in the data, we really have to look at the mechanics of the legal system itself. Like, how does a judge legally justify giving one person a longer sentence than another for the exact same crime?
Right, there has to be a mechanism.
And the critical variable here is judicial discretion.
The mechanism that allowed these ideological preferences to manifest so clearly in the sentencing data is the expansion of discretion. And this requires a brief look at the history of federal sentencing. So, starting in the mid-1980s with the Sentencing Reform Act, federal judges operated under mandatory sentencing guidelines. And these guidelines were basically a rigid mathematical grid.
Like a literal chart.
Literally a chart. You calculate the severity of the offense on one axis, you calculate the criminal history of the defendant on the other axis, and where those two lines meet is the mandatory sentencing range. The judge had very little leeway to deviate from that range based on personal preference. The whole system was designed to heavily constrain discretion in order to promote uniformity.
But that landscape shifted dramatically, and the Cohn and Yang study captures this shift perfectly, because in 2005, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in a case called United States v. Booker. This ruling fundamentally altered the federal system by determining that making those sentencing guidelines mandatory was unconstitutional.
That was a huge pivot.
The Booker decision rendered the previously mandatory guidelines merely advisory. So the judge still calculates the guideline range, but they are no longer strictly bound by it. They were granted vastly expanded discretion to determine the final sentence based on a wide array of statutory factors.
And the Cohn and Yang data captures the before and after effects of the Booker decision with incredible precision. Because prior to the Booker decision, when the mandatory constraints were in place, the interaction between a judge's political affiliation and a defendant's race was statistically insignificant regarding the racial sentencing gap.
The grid kept them in check.
The rigid rules suppressed the ideological bias. But post-Booker, when the constraints were lifted and discretion was expanded, the racial gap driven by political affiliation just surged.
It was only after discretion was expanded that Republican judges began sentencing black defendants 1.3 months longer compared to similar white defendants relative to their Democratic colleagues.
The expansion of discretion provided the exact bureaucratic avenue necessary for those ideological preferences to actually influence the deprivation of liberty.
And the tragic irony of this is how that expansion of discretion was initially framed. I mean, when the mandatory guidelines were in place, legal advocates and reformers fought for decades to dismantle them.
Yeah, they hated the grid.
They argued that mandatory minimums and rigid grids were too draconian, too mechanical. They argued that judges needed the freedom and the discretion to consider the unique human context of each individual defendant. Discretion was championed as a necessary tool for individualized, compassionate justice. Yet the empirical data reveals a chilling inversion of that intent. Instead of resulting in universally applied compassion, the expansion of discretion actually served as a conduit for judges to weaponize the law along ideological lines. It allowed their internal friend-enemy distinctions to dictate the length of a prison sentence.
And it is essential to frame this analysis with strict impartiality. We are not analyzing this to declare one side of the political spectrum morally superior to the other.
No.
The analytical point is that the mechanism of power is identical across the spectrum. Whether one observes a system extending progressive leniency toward approved protests, as we saw in the first defendant in the courtroom scenario, or one observes conservative judges utilizing their discretion to issue harsher sentences to racial outgroups, the underlying architecture is exactly the same. The justice system is acting as an instrument of Schmittian friend-enemy politics.
And the rhetoric of the legal system relies heavily on concepts like fairness, equality before the law, and due process.
Yes, but those concepts are abstractions. They look beautiful in a textbook. But in practice, they are rigorously stress-tested by the presence of the enemy, and the empirical data proves that they frequently fail that test. The law ceases to be a neutral arbiter. It becomes a flexible tool for rewarding the political in-group and punishing the out-group. The expansion of discretion following the Booker decision simply removed the bureaucratic barriers that previously hindered the sovereign application of this distinction.
So we have seen Schmitt's theories operating in emergency government powers during a pandemic, and we have seen them operating in the everyday statistical reality of the federal justice system. Now we need to transition to the third domain, which is arguably the most pervasive and rapidly evolving arena of power today, the digital realm.
The transition from the physical courtroom to the digital tech campus brings us to the realm of the new digital sovereigns. The legal architecture of the state is no longer the only system dividing the world into friends and enemies.
Let's ground this again in the physical reality of how this power is executed on a daily basis. Because we are moving from Whitehall and the federal courthouse to a tech campus in San Francisco. Consider the environment of a content moderator. He is a level 3 content moderator for a major platform's Trust and Safety Council.
Which is quite a title.
Yeah, the title itself, Trust and Safety, feels heavier and more fraught every single week. So Elias sits at a desk, bathed in the harsh blue light of dual monitors. His eyes are bloodshot in the quiet, climate-controlled hum of the office. And he is constantly navigating a deluge of human communication.
The sheer volume of decisions being made by individuals in that position is staggering, and each decision is a micro-application of political logic.
Right. So on this particular day, Elias has 2 posts queued up for a review. On his left screen, there is a post from a prominent conservative student group at a prestigious East Coast university. The post is questioning the integrity of recent election laws, analyzing the mechanics of mail-in voting. The platform's automated algorithm has flagged it under a broad category for undermining democracy. But then, on his right screen, there's a viral thread by a progressive activist. This thread is explicitly calling for the targeted harassment and physical confrontation of those exact same conservative students. Elias's cursor hovers in the digital purgatory between these 2 screens. He has a massive binder of internal guidelines, but it is a labyrinth of subjective loopholes and contradictory precedents. However, the unwritten cultural rule of the institution is as stark as a neon sign. Protect the allies, purge the threat.
The subjective nature of those guidelines forces the moderator to rely on the prevailing ideological assumptions of the organization.
He feels a cold, dull numbness in his chest as he makes the decision. He clicks Remove User on the conservative post, watching the account vanish into the digital ether for questioning election mechanics. Then, shifting to the right monitor, he selects a different tag entirely. He tags the activist's violent thread as protected political expression, ensuring it remains visible and viral.
That is the friend-enemy distinction in real time.
In that moment, he isn't enforcing objective safety. He is drawing the front line of a quiet, bloodless war. He takes a sip of his lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste mirroring the hypocrisy sitting heavy on his tongue, and clicks to the next batch of flagged enemies.
That scenario really encapsulates the precise crisis of governance occurring on the internet today. And to understand the structural forces driving Elias's actions, we have to look at the theoretical framework laid out by legal scholar Paul Gauder in his book, The Networked Leviathan.
Because Gauder makes a really profound argument about the nature of these companies.
He does. He establishes that modern internet platforms, entities like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Amazon, they can no longer be understood merely as private businesses providing a service.
They're way too big for that.
Their scale and function have fundamentally altered their nature. They must be understood as modern states. They face state-like problems of governance, knowledge aggregation, and massive scale. These platforms govern billions of citizens. They create complex rules, they enforce those rules through massive bureaucracies of moderators, and they possess the ultimate coercive power in the digital realm, the power of exile, the power to erase a citizen from the digital public square.
And Gauder argues that the central dilemma these digital states face is that neutral content moderation at a global scale is fundamentally impossible.
It is a logistical and epistemological impossibility. The sheer volume of posts, combined with the infinite diversity of human interaction, cultural nuance, it renders objective, neutral enforcement a complete fantasy.
And he points to a very tragic, real-world example to demonstrate this failure of neutral moderation at scale: the Myanmar genocide in 2016 and 2017.
The Myanmar example is the ultimate proof of the failure of platform neutrality. Because in Myanmar, Facebook was effectively the entire internet for the population. It was the primary infrastructure for news and communication.
Say the monopoly.
Complete monopoly. Yet, despite holding a monopoly on the digital public sphere of a sovereign nation, the company entirely lacked the necessary language capacity. They lacked the local knowledge, the cultural context, and the administrative structure to govern that specific platform neutrally or effectively.
They couldn't differentiate between normal political discourse and coordinated ethnic cleansing.
Because they were attempting to manage it through algorithms designed for engagement and a skeletal crew of moderators who did not understand the local context, the result was catastrophic. The platform acted as a state, but a failed state. It became the unchecked vector for the spread of genocidal propaganda by the military against the Rohingya Muslim minority.
That's horrifying.
It proved that a platform cannot govern neutrally when it does not comprehend the complexities of its user base.
That impossibility of neutrality, the structural inability to just neutrally apply a set of rules across billions of interactions, that is what fuels the relentless conflicting claims of political bias we see in the United States today. Because the platforms cannot be neutral arbiters, every decision they make is viewed through the lens of the friend-enemy distinction.
And both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S. utilize this lens to critique the platforms. They are constantly demanding that the digital sovereign target their specific political enemies.
Let's break those claims down. The right accuses the platforms of systemic ideological censorship, shadow banning, and the suppression of legitimate political discourse. A prime example that is frequently cited is the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story shortly before the 2020 election.
Right, that was a major flashpoint.
In that instance, major platforms like Twitter and Facebook severely restricted the distribution of a major news report published by one of the country's oldest newspapers. And they justified the suppression based on opaque, rapidly shifting rules regarding hacked materials and misinformation.
Which seemed to come out of nowhere.
Right, this was not an algorithmic error. This is viewed as explicit evidence of the digital sovereign directly intervening in an election to protect its political allies and silence its political enemies.
And conversely, the left looks at the exact same platforms and accuses them of dangerous under-enforcement. From their perspective, the platforms are failing to protect the democratic ecosystem. They argue that the companies prioritize engagement, virality, and profit over public safety, which allows right-wing extremism, hate speech, and organized disinformation networks to flourish.
And the primary example cited from this perspective is the treatment of Donald Trump prior to 2021. The left argued for years that he was allowed to routinely violate the terms of service, inciting violence, spreading misinformation with absolute impunity, simply because his presence generated massive traffic and revenue for the platforms. They view the platform's initial reluctance to ban such figures as a capitulation to the right, an abdication of the sovereign's duty to protect the public from a threat.
What is fascinating is that both sides are essentially making the exact same demand. They both perceive the platform as a sovereign entity, and they are both furious that the sovereign is failing to properly identify and eliminate the correct enemy.
And the culmination of these immense political tensions arrived on January 6, 2021. And this event provides the clearest, most undeniable example of a Schmittian state of exception occurring in the digital age.
Following the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, the digital sovereigns executives like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook and Jack Dorsey at Twitter, they made an unprecedented decision. They decided to comprehensively deplatform the sitting president of the United States.
And it is crucial to analyze the mechanics of how that decision was made, because this was not a standard bureaucratic application of the terms of service. It wasn't a moderator in a cubicle checking off a box on a guideline sheet.
No, if the written terms of service were the sole metric, objective action would have been taken years prior. The terms of service were not the driving force here. This was an explicit manual declaration of an emergency by the highest levels of the digital executive branch.
They declared the exception.
The executives recognized a sudden existential threat. And the threat was not just to the physical building of the Capitol. The threat was to the political stability of the United States, the very liberal democratic order in which these massive technology companies reside, operate, and generate hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth.
So a threat to the stability of that liberal democratic order was recognized as a direct threat to the survival of the platforms themselves.
In pure Schmittian terms, the rules were suspended to address the crisis. The executives stepped entirely outside the established daily moderation guidelines, the normal bureaucratic processes, and they exercised raw sovereign power. They identified what they perceived to be the enemy of their political and economic ecosystem, and they eliminated that enemy from the digital realm. The objective reality of the emergency dictated the action, and the sovereign executed it without a trial, without an appeal, and without relying on pre-existing precedent.
That he decided on the exception. But Carl Schmitt's theory of the exception primarily focuses on the acute moment of the crisis.
Sure.
He analyzes the moment the sovereign suspends the rules. His framework sort of fails to adequately account for what happens after the emergency has passed, after the sovereign action is complete and the dust begins to settle. Like, how does a massive global institution like Facebook justify that raw dictatorial exercise of power once the immediate threat is neutralized?
Yeah.
They can't just say, we did it because we have all the power. They need to reconstruct the illusion of neutrality.
That requirement, the need to justify the raw exercise of power after the fact, brings us to the precise function of Meta's oversight board.
The oversight board. It is such a fascinating institutional structure because it was created by Meta as an independent quasi-judicial body, heavily funded and staffed by global experts, politicians, and legal scholars.
Right.
Its stated purpose is to review major content moderation decisions, operating almost like a digital Supreme Court.
And following the unprecedented deplatforming of Trump, Facebook essentially submitted their own sovereign decision to this board for review. And the way the board functioned in this instance is highly revealing. The board did not overturn the decision. They reviewed the ban, and they agreed that the initial suspension was entirely justified by the extreme circumstances of January 6th.
So they validated the state of exception.
They did. However, they criticized Facebook for the indefinite nature of the penalty. They argued that an indefinite ban lacked a clear basis in Facebook's written policies, because it was an emergency sovereign action, not a policy application.
Right. So the board ordered Facebook to reassess the penalty and apply a defined proportional response based on actual rules.
So the function of the oversight board in this scenario is not to act as a true Supreme Court checking executive overreach. It acts to rationalize and regularize the executive's emergency action.
It functions more like a retroactive PR firm for the sovereign. It writes a detailed constitutional justification for an execution that already took place.
Exactly. It converts raw dictatorial sovereign power into bureaucratic quasi-legal precedent for the future. The board provides a procedural gloss that allows the platform to maintain the outcome of the permanent silencing of the identified enemy while projecting an illusion of the rule of law.
It domesticates the emergency.
But it domesticates the emergency. It ensures that the next time a similar existential threat arises, the platform will not have to declare a naked state of exception all over again. They can simply point to the intricate bureaucratic precedent established by the board. The architecture of power remains exactly the same. It is just wrapped in the comforting language of legal procedure.
And when we weave these three distinct domains together, a singular, unyielding architecture of power is revealed. Whether we are analyzing the actions of UK politicians who ruthlessly exploited the COVID-19 lockdowns to exempt themselves from restrictions while simultaneously penalizing the public with draconian threats, or whether we are analyzing the empirical data of U.S. judges who utilize the expansion of sentencing discretion to disproportionately punish racial and ideological outgroups while protecting those aligned with their worldview, or whether we are analyzing the actions of Silicon Valley executives who manually curate the boundaries of acceptable digital speech and then utilize quasi-judicial boards to retroactively rationalize the purging of their political opponents, the underlying engine is entirely identical.
It is the exercise of sovereignty, defined purely by the ability to decide the exception and the organization of all political life around the strict, unyielding division between friend and enemy.
We are taught to revere universal principles. We are instructed from a young age that free speech, equality before the law, and democracy are the bedrock of our civilization. We assume these are absolute rules that govern everyone equally. But rigorous observation of how institutions actually behave shows that these are often not universal principles at all. They are privileges. They are privileges extended exclusively to political friends, and they are ruthlessly withheld from political enemies. When the system exhibits glaring double standards, it is not broken. It is not malfunctioning. It is operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency, doing exactly what Carl Schmitt predicted, drawing the battle lines of reality.